knitters! I'm so excited you're here! Guys, today's video is full of information. I hope it's not going to be information overload, but I really just wanted to kind of just one video, all the information's for just the basic before you start knitting. I might end up breaking this into a series eventually, and like each topic that I talk on go like deep into that topic and make it one video. But for now, it's just quick stop, watch this video, take notes. So maybe you want to pause this, go get some pen and paper and enjoy. I hope this really helps you start to learn how to knit. I started my quick stitch videos. I am loving them. I've had a great response. And I realized there was one more video I needed to make for the absolute beginner knitters. That's what this is about. And what this video is going to tell you is what you need to actually like start knitting. Because obviously I don't explain that in the quick stitches videos. And I had this moment where I was like, well, it's great they can see the stitches, but they might not even realize what they need to purchase or what items are common in the knitting world. So that is what today's video is about. Welcome to my couch. I'm just imagining that you're sitting here talking to me as a friend and you're like, Heidi, what do we need? I really want to start knitting. So let's start talking knitting. The first item you will need, which you might already have in your house, you can get fancier if you want to, but if you have it in your house, you can just use what you have. Scissors. Yep. You need a good pair of little scissors or big scissors. Like I said, you need a pair of scissors to snip the ends when you get to the end of your project. Okay, now these items, these are called stitch markers. You might need them right away, you might not. They're good to have for when you need them. You're like, oh, that's why I need them. So they're not super expensive. So if you're like, I'm just getting the basics, go ahead and get a set of stitch markers. And then this is called a tapestry needle, a darning needle. After all these years of knitting, I'm still not totally sure what they're called, but basically they're fat, right? And they're not sharp, like at all. And when I say they're fat, like my yarn fits through that. So that is also just the basics of like finishing a project. You do something that's called weaving in your ends, and you need this to do that. So again, just get one. When you're ready for it, you'll be happy it's sitting there in your house. All right, the knitting needles. Not all knitting needles are the same. They're not the same size. And I am going to show you the 3 different versions of knitting needles you can get. And essentially, you only need one of them to begin with. So, but I'm going to introduce you to all of them. We've got what's called a set of double pointed knitting needles. They get stitches put on them, and then you connect them together, and when they're connected together, you knit in what's called knitting in the round. You can use this for knitting socks, gloves, stuffed animals. You've seen my Christmas baubles. They are always started on double pointed knitting needles. And then when I get to a certain length, I move on to what's called, or a certain width, I move on to what's called circular needles. Okay, so double pointed knitting needles. This is my favorite type of knitting needles, and though I need double pointed knitting needles for very specific things, I otherwise only use what's called a circular needle or circular knitting needle. And you can use these for so many things, and they're my favorite. They just are. Like, if I was gonna buy you a set of like knitting needles and yarn, they would be circular. They're easier to use. You can use them for more projects. You can knit in the round with them, and you can knit flat. And so I find them just the most versatile, and they're my favorite. They don't bump into my knees, especially these tiny ones. They don't bump into my knees while I'm knitting. So anyway, my favorite circular knitting needles. I would say these might be the most like, I'm going to find them in movies, straight knitting needles, or I find them in my grandma's stuff, you know, that was passed down to me. Again, a lot of times straight knitting needles. I don't know the history. Maybe someday I should do a video on that of like how straight knitting needles finally like turned into what's called the circular. This is like a bigger pair of circular knitting needles. And like I told you, I always use circular knitting needles. So, yeah. So as far as what you see in movies, you probably see these guys a lot, and I guess they're prettier. I'm like, I don't know. But as for practical reasons, again, circular. For multiple reasons. One, I own them, so why own these? I don't need these to make a flat project because I can do it on here. But I do need this to make a circular project, which you can't do with these. Okay, future Heidi here. I was watching through as I was editing my video, and I do want to add right here that technically you can create round projects on straight needles, but it's because you seam them together. Like, you know, if you've ever sewn something, you sew the flat pieces together. So in technical terms, you can do that. If you're knitting in the round, you can't do that on straight knitting needles. Just wanted to jump on real quick and clarify that because, yeah, just want to make sure you guys knew. So it's obviously up to you. If you're for nostalgic reasons or like, I want to use my grandma's knitting needles, totally use your grandma's knitting needles, make a scarf, do something fun with it when you're ready to move on to circular projects like hats, you know, socks, all the things. Circular, you're gonna want a pair of circular knitting needles for sure, or a pair of double pointed knitting needles. Like, I know some people are very into the double pointed knitting needles for making socks and stuff. I just happen to like, I like these little fellas like a bunch. And I think some people, maybe the smaller needles might hurt their hands, like it feels cramped. I speaking from experience, that's not, I find these just, I love these. Like, I think these are just the best. Now for what is a knitting project? Where do we start? What does it mean to knit in the round, to knit flat? Like, there's so many just words that are put out there and you're like, what in the world, Heidi? Can you explain this to us? Totally, let's talk. So when I say knit in the round, it's so beyond literal. There is knitting in the round. There's no break. I have a stitch marker to know, can you see my stitch marker? Look at that. To know, the stitch marker is to know where the beginning and the end of the round is, but you literally just keep knitting in the round and go and go and go. It's actually quite soothing to knit in the round. I knit in the round for socks, for mittens, for hats. I haven't finished any of my sweaters, but my sweaters that I have all started but not finished are also knit in the round. And that is what knitting in the round means. Just continuing to knit around and around and around. And no seams, which is awesome. Knitting flat would be a project like my washcloths or scarf. And really all that means is you're knitting back and forth until you get the desired shape or size of your project. We have gone through what you need so far. A pair of scissors, the little needle to weave in the ends, or the big fat needle to weave in the ends, some stitch markers, and you have seen the 3 different versions of knitting needles that you need, what our personal favorite is, and what knitting in the round is, and what's knitting flat is, the back and forth. All right. Whew. How do we get to the knitting, the literal you want to knit? So we start with what's called the cast on. And casting on just means you are putting the loops, these guys right here, onto your knitting needle. I would recommend, like for a first part project, literally just doing a really, really basic scarf. So you would cast on, you know, like how big do you want your scarf? So all projects start with casted on stitches. And, you know, if you're following a pattern, it will say cast on this many, and there we go. Casting on. This is obviously, I cast it on way down here and increased and did all this other stuff. But this is it. Truthfully, guys, this is like one of the first projects I learned as a child. So don't feel like you can't move on to this. This does have 3 different stitches. Yeah, 3 different stitches, but like if I could, you can learn it. I believe in you. So casting on. Normally the cast on starts with a literal slip knot, and then from there you can watch my videos. I have the old Norwegian cast on video on there. That's my favorite way of casting on. There are so many different ways to cast on, and there's different reasons to use different methods. So different projects, as you get more into it, will be more specific. But to just start, say a scarf, let's just talk scarves. Let's keep it super simple, just straight knitting, right? You would cast on a certain amount of stitches, and you would just, so you'd start with the slip knot, cast on the amount of stitches you want, and then you literally can just start knitting. Like, go to that video that shows you exactly how to do that. So in my video of how to knit, I tell you guys that I'm knitting 2 different styles. I say Continental and English style. And really what that means is the yarn that you use to wrap around your knitting needle is being held by either your left hand or your right hand. And I can do both. It's not like, oh, I'm left-handed, so I do it this way, or I'm right-handed, or I do it that way. It doesn't mean that at all. It just literally is like, one's in your right hand and one's in your left hand. Oh, guys, we're gonna talk yarn. So, just so you know, when you go to the store, you're gonna see different thick and thinness of yarns. You use them for different projects. So like for socks, you tend to use like a fingering weight yarn, which is like really thin and fine and super soft and wonderful. And then you've got like thicker yarn like this, or the socks I've been making, the DK weight spiral socks, that is a thicker, squishier yarn, which can make really squishy, soft projects. And they're great, and sweaters, and like there's different reasons to use different yarns for different projects. The yarn thing is huge. But if you, again, first time buying, go into the store, find your yarn. Guys, I don't like acrylic yarn. I just don't. I like all the natural stuff. I do understand that my stock yarn has a little bit of nylon in it, but oh, future Heidi here again. I just want to clarify here that there's certain reasons why you mix things like nylon into your yarn for durability, and I think a few other reasons. So if you're like, wait, she kind of talked about it, but just didn't. I just was more getting to the point that my favorite fibers are definitely the natural fibers for our environment, you know, all the things. But there are some uses for things, say like the little bit of nylon that's mixed in, and it's a really big topic that I'm just not talking about in this video. I'm all about the natural fibers, so cotton, wool, I just are my favorites. And so when you go in, if you're at an actual local yarn shop, you can get a lot of help from whoever is there. They're going to be happy to help. We love people learning how to knit. Just as a group of people, we're like, you want to learn how to knit? Heck yeah, come, let me tell you. So if you can find a local yarn shop, don't let it intimidate you. I would actually recommend that. Go to a local yarn shop. Don't be intimidated by the super expensive yarns. Don't be judgmental about the super expensive yarns, because I've seen some novice say some things that I just kind of want to giggle at, where they're like, oh, these $30 balls of yarn, like these people are insane. And they say it to a group of knitters, and we're like, well, don't look at our stashes, because we own that $30 ball of yarn, plus so many of their friends. But there's a reason why we do own that really nice yarn, why we like supporting the dyers and the businesses. You know, that's a whole nother video that I might never make, because I don't oh, I might make at some point. But anyway, getting sidetracked, guys. So I would recommend, if you can find a local yarn store, look it up, Google it. I do that a lot of times when I know we're going to like a small town while we're traveling or going to the beach. I always am like, local yarn store in Tillamook, Oregon, right? And it will normally show me at least one or within like a radius of that spot. You might be surprised at what's by your house. So, and again, going back to local businesses and supporting them, like it's a big deal for the local yarn shops to have us buy our yarn from them. And they're helpful and they're just helpful. Like they're so fun and wonderful. I love my local yarn shop, which is actually an hour away from here, but that's fine. So you need to get a pair of knitting needles and a ball of yarn to start with. When you buy your ball of yarn, you know what, guys? Let me pause this because I gotta find exactly what I just realized I didn't. Hold on. I'll be right back. All right, guys. So what I wanted to tell you was on the yarn that you purchase, there's going to be the size of knitting needle. The overall should work with that yarn. So that is important for you to know so that when you purchase a set of knitting needles, you can get the complementary size yarn for the pair of knitting needles that you have. Okay, so you get your knitting needles, you find a pair of yarn, or maybe you start with the yarn and then you can be like, oh, that yarn says to get a size 5 knitting needle. Let me do that. Now, I will say there's a thing called gauge. And it does matter. You will find many knitters, no matter how long they've been knitting, still's never done a gauging swatch. Like maybe myself. Confession time, right? But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And I'm learning, even after all these years, that I still need to do it. Okay, where I was going with that though is when you're knitting to gauge, you might have to adjust, like going up a needle size or down a needle size. Truly, it's a way bigger topic than you as a very, very, very beginner person that wants to just maybe start with knitting a scarf or a washcloth. Really even needs to know. But I'm just putting it in here that if you suddenly see this word and you're like, Heidi didn't talk about this, what gives? It's because, yes, you need to know about it, but it's like, today you don't need to worry about it. Talked about casting on, then you knit your project to length. Say, let's just, for a scarf, for example, because that's just, keep knitting, great thing to practice on. You'll be, when you do just a knit stitch, you're gonna have a texture like this because you're just knitting back and forth. And that's called the garter stitch, just so you know. So if you're like, wait, it doesn't look like, let's see. These socks have a lot of other textures in it, so I'm not sure if it's a great example of what you might be used to seeing. So yeah, if you're going back and forth and you're just knitting, this is what your texture of your, say, scarf is going to be. So just want to clarify that. But when you get to the end of your scarf, there's actually one more thing that you're going to learn how to do, which is called binding off. And it just makes it so that your stitches don't unravel when you remove them from your knitting needles. And there's like I said, there's a specific stitch, the bind off stitch. And it's very important because you do not want to just pull your project off, because if you do, it will completely unravel. And that is very sad. Don't do that, please. I'm leaning towards almost getting your ball of yarn. So if you like find a ball of yarn you really like, then get your knitting needles, because you can look on your ball of yarn like I showed you guys and say, oh, it says to, say you're using DK weight yarn, which is the stuff I use for my spiral socks. You have it, it says size 5 knitting needles. Then you can be like, I can go buy 5 size knitting needles. I almost feel like that might be the easiest way to start. Now, I will say, this is the funniest thing, is you hear me talk about my washcloths all the time. And the truth is, these knitting needles are technically not the right size that the label tells me to get for this type of yarn. And that's okay, because as you get more into knitting, you realize certain projects for certain reasons need bigger or smaller knitting needles. So this is nice and squishy and bendy, and I like that. I don't want a really tight stitch on my washcloths. So truly, let me look at the label. The label says size 7, US size 7 knitting needles. And these are size 10 and a half. So like, it really is quite a bit of a looser stitch. And I'm knitting a sweater right now that's out of the DK weight yarn, this stuff, which I use the size 5 for the socks and what the label actually says. And I'm using my 10 and a half knitting needles on. So the sweater will be a lot looser and just kind of just fun, and not necessarily, I don't know if flowy is the right word, but just very loose and just comfy maybe looking. I don't know. I'm not necessarily good at explaining the drapes of, and when I mean drape, what that means is like how the fabric drapes on things, like how it lays, whatever. I'm not a pro at explaining the exact detail of what it should or shouldn't feel like. Maybe we'll get better at it, making these videos. So anyway, yeah, so I hope, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to let you guys know. Honestly, in the comment section, tell me. I would love to continue the series of like, for beginners, this is the question, because I might not actually realize the questions you guys have, because when I learned to knit, I was 6 and maybe didn't even know the right questions to ask, because I was 6, because 6-year-olds think very different than a grown-up. So, yeah, please leave me a comment on here, on Instagram. Say, hey Heidi, I really, as a knitter, this confuses me. Can you make a video? Tell me, I would love it. Literally, I would love to answer your questions. That's it, guys. That's the basics of knitting before you start knitting information. I hope it will be helpful, and I hope I've answered some of your questions on just understanding the anatomy of knitting. Remember, cast on, knit, bind off. Knitting needle size, knitting needle or yarn size. Label tells us and helps us figure that out. And if you can get to a local yarn shop, they're super helpful. So anyway, I hope you're having an awesome day, and I hope to catch you in another video. Bye!